one of the things that kind of distinguishes literacy and numeracy is that these are acquired skills, or largely acquired skills, particularly in the case of literacy. It's something that we kind of developed as a species and taught each other. You could say the same for complex maths as well, but I will certainly argue that that there is a basic sense of numeracy that is independent of what we learn in school. And even with literacy, obviously literacy is something we learn in school, but it's tapping visual mechanisms, it's tapping language processes, and so on. And these themselves are kind of independent of schooling and culture, and so on. So these to me represent interesting examples of how we become experts in things, but actually relying on the building blocks of how the brain works and what's been endowed to us by evolution and so on. And we can kind of illustrate this with what I would call kind of innate versus cultural aspects of number. And basically having a rough idea of quantity, roughly how many are there, and maybe, how many exactly are there, is something we can do without knowing that this symbol here is representing the number 5 or whatever. But nevertheless, there are high-level maths to do with number names, which are from our language, how we write them, equations and so on, which we have learned, that are pure cultural inventions, that are nevertheless piggybacking on our basic kind of sense of how much and how many. And we can show that infants have a basic understanding of number using habituation studies. So in habituation studies, you present stimuli over time, and eventually an infant will become disengaged, it will look away. So each one of these stimuli is unique. So this one is different from that, it's different from that, and so on. They're physically unique, but actually these ones here share the same set of numbers. Here these are all 2, and then all of a sudden you go to 3. What you find here is that the infants will get bored as it looks at the number 2, and then at this point it will regain its attention, it will dishabituate, it will become interested in this. So this is kind of tracking the basic sense that the infant knows the difference between 3 and 2, even though they're all physically different. And it's not just that it likes the number 3, and that's why it kind of engages with it. So here we've got different versions of 3, and then we go to 2, and the infant would dishabituate there. And basically infants can do this with relatively small numbers. It can't tell the difference between 8 and 9, for instance, and we'll come back to that in a bit, but it can tell the difference between, say, 8 and 16, okay? So it's partly to do with the relative and the absolute size of the set. But basically, you could kind of probe what they can and cannot discriminate and actually get a nice psychometric function from infants. And somewhat bizarrely, you can do this for birds, chimpanzees, other animals, or whatever, and see how they can understand differences between number, whether they can tell the difference between 8 and 18, or 8 and 9, for instance, just by looking at them. And again, here, this is kind of Neolithic man, so tens of thousands of years ago, people were doing counting on bones. I think this is a bone rather than a rock. Here they're counting the cycles of the moon and so on, so they're marking off in dark when the moon is full or absent or whatever it might be. And you can see these kind of cycles there, so in pre-literate times, basically. So what is the meaning of numbers? The meaning of numbers is basically its size. The term numerosity is often given. That's basically the size of a collection. So that would be dealing with integer numbers, where things that you can count. Whereas quantity might be things like area or length and so on, which you can measure, but they're not countable quantities. They're continuous rather than discrete. But the idea is that both of these are kind of estimates of magnitude, whether it's exact integer numbers or kind of more continuous dimensions. So a telephone number is a number, but it doesn't have the same meaning, by which the telephone number is like a code. It's not actually carrying anything about size or quantity. I can't say that my telephone number is bigger than yours. You could, but that's not what the telephone number is. It's just using numbers in another way. So a telephone number is a number, but it does not have the meaning of conventional numbers. It is something else. And really the meaning of numbers is quite abstract. So here you can talk about different codes, so 3 fingers, the letter 3, and so on. And you can talk about different things being enumerated, so 3 ideas, 3 elephants, 3 computers. So again, these all carry something in common, the idea of 3-ness, but actually it can vary from 3 ideas to 3 elephants. So to actually understand that that is representing the same concept is not a trivial thing. And actually, the meaning of numbers has its own kind of set of regions in the brain that seems to be separate from, to some extent, other aspects of meaning. So patients with semantic dementia are still very good at kind of understanding numbers, for instance, in basic maths, despite losing a lot of language and understanding about animals and objects and this sort of thing. And basically, we can study numbers in several ways. One is using what are called symbolic numbers. So these are our words and our symbols, so digits and so on. Or we can look at non-symbolic, and that's quantities, things. So how many dots are there, for instance? And you can do this in several ways. So here you can ask, how many yellow dots are there, for instance? And that will give you an exact quantity. Or you can ask, relative differences, so are there more yellow than blue here, for instance? And there you don't actually have to count, you just have to use some kind of intuition as to what there is. So how do people actually make these kinds of judgments? So what you find here is that when these are with adults now, adult humans, I'll talk about other species a little bit. Basically, you get several effects here. So one is a size effect. And basically what that means is that if your task here is to say which is bigger, yellow or blue, that it will be much harder if you've got 20 yellow and 10 blue than if you've got 10 yellow and 5 blue. So even though the ratio is the same, the more stuff that's out there, the harder it is. And that's kind of what's called the size effect. You've also got the distance effect. So that's basically that discriminating 6 from 5 is harder than 7 from 5. So here you've got a distance of 1 in effect, and here you've got a distance of 2. So infants show also these effects, but they are just less tuned to these. They both show size and distance effects, but we just have finer tuning. We can go here to distances of 1. As you go to maybe 12, then you can discriminate accurately and say 12 from 16, but not 12 from 13, and so on. And these are obviously presented quite quickly. The point at which these are presented, say for 10 seconds, you'll be 100%. You can just go and count them. Okay, so these are just presented briefly for a flash. So you cannot count. You're just going on a kind of a basic judgment. How many? Is there more blues than yellows here? And you can effectively do this with other species where they get a reward for getting it right. And you could show that they also show these basic principles, that the relative difference and the absolute difference, the size and distance effects is important in our species. What's also important is that this seems to matter. So basically, if you were to give this test to, I can't remember the age, but I think they get it to like 6-year-olds, and it predicts your SAT score several years later. So these are kind of lab-based tests, but they actually reflect your ability to do regular kind of culturally based maths. So this is, I call this non-cultural, because it's not something you're taught to do in school, this kind of thing, whereas doing sums is. But one seems to predict the other. So people describe this aspect of discriminating numbers kind of a startup kit, that the more finely tuned you're able to distinguish these different quantities helps you to kind of understand more kind of school-based maths, in effect. There are a group of people who you can think of as being the number equivalent of dyslexia, and this is this thing called dyscalculia, that's how you pronounce it, so developmental dyscalculia. It means children who are relatively impaired in kind of understanding numbers relative to other aspects of intelligence or cognition. Unlike dyslexia, it's not kind of recognised by the government as a specific learning impairment, even though there's quite good evidence from psychology that it exists. And one of the reasons for this is partly political rather than scientific, that as soon as you do that, you're going to need a whole set of resources and things around that to deal with this. But basically what you find is that people with developmental dyscalculia are struggling in school-based maths, also have less ability to discriminate quantity when things are flashed at kind of sub-second intervals, knowing whether they're yellow or blue. So again, it suggests that this is quite a basic thing, and it's not just to do with your level of schooling. So these are relative judgments here, which is more yellow or blues. What about in absolute judgments? So here what you've got is that you're just presented here with arrays of dots, so these are non-symbolic, and you just have to say how many they are. Basically, what's found here is two different effects. And that's basically between about 1 and 4, people can tell you exactly how many are there without counting. That means that you've got a flat line here. In effect, so people can give you the answer straight away without counting. What you've got after that is this kind of almost linear increase, and at this point they're kind of guessing or they give up. And what that means is that in order to say how many are there, you're having to go 1, 2, 3, so on. So the amount of items there are linearly scales with how long it takes you to do the problem. So this is the number of errors here. This is this. Obviously, you can be completely error-free if you're not under time pressure. I'm assuming everybody could eventually count accurately. There were 8 things there. Okay. What this has kind of suggested is that for when you're having to get exact quantities, that there are 2 mechanisms at play. People call subitizing the ability to know exactly how many things are there at a glance. And the idea is that when you look at an array of something, if there are less than 4, you can get it perfectly accurate. And beyond that, basically, you're having to do something else. You're having to either approximate or you're having to count. But you cannot just look at an array of 7 things and say that there are 7. You can say that there are about 7, or you could look at it for long enough and go, Okay. And this also is kind of relevant because it suggests that this one here might be more of your kind of basic mechanism, and this one here might be more language dependent. It depends on us being able to track using language where we're going and to kind of hold in mind kind of number sets, and I'll come back to that in a bit. Here, these are the equivalent studies of what I call symbolic. So here you're presenting people with digits. So you present them with the numbers 3 and 6, and you just ask which number is larger. Easy, 6. Which number is larger between 9 and 8? The answer is 9. Which number is larger, 2 and 7? The answer is 7. But what you have here is that people find this one harder than the other. That's because there's a distance between them of only 1. And that's what we've got here, a distance effect. So that there means that you're taking 100 milliseconds in judging that relative to this, for instance, an extra 100 milliseconds. But what's interesting about this is that you kind of might imagine that the bottleneck here, the reason why this kind of task is difficult, is that it's kind of tapping your visual complexity. You're having to kind of track them in mind. Here, there's nothing visually complex between 9 and 8. So they're just squiggles on a piece of paper. So it suggests that it is something to do with your representation of number, that basically you can't pull apart in your head 8 and 9 as easily as 3 and 6, even when they're just written symbols and they're not to do with the amount of things on the screen, that there's something less discriminable about 8 and 9 relative to 3 and 6 in your head, because it's not on the page in this case. And you would have the same effect for a size effect. So deciding which number is bigger of 5 and 3 is easier, that's slower than 4 and 2. So here, as the numbers get bigger, the 5 and 3 is going to be slower than 4 and 2. Deciding between 9 and 7 is going to be much slower than deciding between 1 and 3, for instance. And I'll talk about why this happens in the brain in a minute. So the idea is that you've kind of that these kind of symbolic and non-symbolic codes also kind of interact. So here, if you're asked to decide which of these is physically larger, so in this case the answer is 9, in this case the answer is 2, People are slower here at telling you that 2 is physically larger than 9. And the idea behind that is that you're automatically computing something about the real quantity of that you cannot just treat these as physical stimuli, you're treating them as having meaning. And so it's a number version of the Stroop effect, if you will. The Stroop effect's normally with colour, so the colours interfere, but here it's your deeper knowledge of what the number means that's interfering. And you will have the same effect here, so you have to say which is numerically larger. So here the answer is 9, here the answer is 9, but here it's harder because although this is numerically larger, this is physically larger. Okay, so physical size and kind of abstract notion of quantity are kind of tapping very similar mechanisms in the brain, in effect. So these kind of cultural symbols that we as a species have learned, no other species have learned, is tapping the physical world, which is common with other species. There's another way of looking at this. And all these number codes will kind of prime each other, and there is a region of the brain that shows these kind of size and distance effects. This is what's called a priming study, where basically you're just presented with, on the computer screen, the word 7, S-E-V-E-N, and you just have to say whether that number is greater than or less than 5. What you find is that if you're presented with 7 as a word, and then you're presented with 7 as digits, or 7 as a dice array, for instance, that you are that one thing will prime the other. So making a judgment about 7 as a word will prime you to be better at making judgments about 7 as dots or digits, and so on. Here you just have to decide whether they're on the same side of 5 or not. Okay. What happens if your language system is impoverished? So I did send around this paper, but I didn't kind of push you to read it very strongly because I know everyone's got deadlines, so some people have. But basically this is an Amazonian culture, so you find it in this kind of number systems in countries like Brazil, but you also find in Australia amongst the Aborigines. And basically what they have is that they do not have number words for every possible number. So their counting system effectively goes like 1, 2, 3, many lots. Okay, and that's it. Here you can, they do have a few more gradations here. What you've got here is basically that you just present people with stimulus numerosity. You present them with, say, an array. So you present them with like arrays of dots, and you just say, what would you call that? Okay. Here you would have full agreement unless people miscount or whatever in terms of what we call it. We'd call it 15 or 16, whatever. What you find here is that they have full agreement up to about 4. So they know what to call it. But even then, it's not really. There's a bit of variation as to what you call something with 4. And then after that, they use these very generic things about hands. For instance, so 2 hands is probably about 10. Okay, but it could be 8, could be 12, who cares, okay? And then you get to something that's many, really, really many. Now the question is, if your culture has numbers like this, how can you do kind of cognitive tests? Can you, for instance, tell the difference between 8 and 9, given that your language does not tell the difference between 8 and 9? Or what is their understanding of those kind of number concepts if they are not embedded within their culture? Right, I will carry on. I will assume that you haven't read the paper. If you have, you've obviously got a bit of background knowledge. Basically what they did is that they did a set of tests with this tribe who are called the Munduruku. And obviously you can't give them words. You can't ask them to add together 8 and 5 because they can't. They don't have words for that, and they don't have words for the answer for that. They'll just say many, in their language. So what you can do is that you can give them, for instance, you can give them, in this case, it was pebbles in the tin. So what you do is that you put in this case, 5 of these things in there. Then you take out that number and then you present them with 3 alternatives, okay? And the question is, can they decide which is the correct one? So if they can do that, it tells you that they can discriminate between the number 5 and the number 4, in effect. So here their language is just on the cusp of being able to do that. And you can obviously do it with bigger numbers, so you can add, say, 13 stones and then take 10 out and see whether they can get the answer correctly. So this is subtraction, and you could do it with addition. Here, this is approximate. So basically, the idea is that they're presented with these large amounts there. Okay, right, I'm just looking at the data, trying to get my head around. Yeah, you're presented with this here, that there, then you ask, is that about right? Okay, in effect. So here you haven't got time to count them, so your language can't help you here. So let's have a look at the difference between them. Basically what you find is that they're bad at this task when you have to give an exact answer. So they can do it. This is the Munduruku here, and these are French speakers. It was a French research group who did it. What you find is that the Munduruku can do this when the difference here, when the size of this collection is up to about 3 or 4. Okay. After that, they become error-prone, in effect, that they can't quite tell the difference here between them. So here the Munduruku effectively start to fail when this set becomes big and you're taking away an exact number. So here you have, it's not approximately how many is there, it's exactly how many are there, and the answer is just a few out. Here, basically, what you have is that you're looking at kind of ratios, so which one is more N1 or N2, and is N3 kind of plausible. And what you find is that they can do this with that. So what this suggests is that basically that language here, or being able to give exact names for every number, is important for doing exact arithmetic when the numbers are relatively large, and by large, I mean more than about 4 or 5. And beyond that, you can do approximate arithmetic. So again, you can roughly tell the difference between, say, 15 and 20, but you're probably going to struggle to tell the difference between 15 and 16 unless you can count them exactly. And obviously, if your language supports that and you give it enough time, you can. Even if you're given enough time, your language cannot enable you to discriminate 15 or 16. There's nothing you can do.
Would there be any significant difference between the abilities of the Munduruku tribe and infants that don't have language ability yet?
I think the idea is that they would be more similar to that. They probably wouldn't be exactly the same because obviously there are other things that are kind of going on in infants as well, so like the visual ability to kind of track multiple objects and so on, as well as the kind of the number sense, if you want to call it that way. But this is the idea, is that without language, this is kind of where you go. And this is the idea in other animals as well, is that they kind of have this sort of system, that they can know exactly how many things are there for small numbers, and beyond that, it's just roughly how they are. So one question is, why do they do this, and why don't they kind of adopt necessarily our system? Obviously, it's a bit of a loaded question, but what would force them to kind of adopt our system, I suppose? So any ideas? So the idea there is around trading, basically. So as soon as you're trading with somebody, there will be a strong cultural drive to be able to give exact quantities, because basically you will give over 15 of things and somebody will give you 13 back and say it's a fair trade, okay, because you can't keep track of those minor differences necessarily, and you have no way of doing it. So at that point you would do it. So the cultures who have this sort of thing tend to be non-trading cultures, in effect. And as soon as you are trading, you are going to need to do something different with this. And this sounds like a very kind of Western kind of thing. It's like, of course we could do better if we change our culture. When we come to looking at literacy, I can ask the same question about us. Why do we still insist on spelling the word knife with the letter K? Okay, and it's like, it's the same thing as telling the Munduruku to change it. It's like, we do that because we're proud of our culture and our inheritance and the fact that we used to spell it like this a few hundred years ago. The fact that it makes it very hard for children, it means that our dyslexia goes up and so on. So we develop these kind of cultural inertias, basically, and there has to be a big pressure for us to move outside of it. So we can take a very Western view of this, why don't they do something more sophisticated, but we can turn that on ourselves because we're capable of doing far more sophisticated things ourselves, but we choose not to. So how does this work in the brain? So there's a region of the brain called the intraparietal sulcus that we've already seen as being involved in attention and things like this, but it's also involved in number meaning. And we can see this if you're doing fMRI of healthy individuals, where you compare, for instance, doing calculation against simply naming letters or digits. And if you take patients with brain damage who've lost the ability to understand numbers, then they would have damage here, often in the left. It seems to be a bit more left hemisphere than right. If you think about right as being more important for spatial attention, the left equivalents are kind of involved in number. So if you do fMRI studies, you can show that this intraparietal sulcus region is more active when you're doing calculation than reading numbers. It's sensitive to subliminal priming when the priming target different numbers. So this would be, for instance, if you see the number 5 as a digit and then you see the letters FIVE, for instance, that it will kind of show priming to that. But if you've got 5 and then 6, it will not prime. It shows distance effects for both digits and number words. What this means is that the number 5 and the number 6 will tend to prime each other more than the number 5 and the number 8. And that will happen both if you present dot arrays and if you present kind of digits for this as well. And it shows habituation to repeated numbers of items in a dot array, a little bit like the infant's kind of tracking whether there are 2 or 3 objects. You can do this with healthy adults and just look at how the brain signal kind of habituates just by viewing different numbers. So this is a region that is core to number reading, and again, it's in a different system from a lot of the language-based ones. People have looked in macaques to see whether there are neurons that are sensitive to different numbers. It looks a little bit like the Munduruku system, but it's rather different. Basically, what you find is in this intraparietal sulcus area and also in the frontal lobes is that you have neurons that are tuned to different numbers. So here what you've got is that you're just presenting these dot arrays and the animal just has to say, keep track of how many there are and so on. And you're recording from individual neurons. So it's not fMRI where you're recording from a large brain region. What you find here is that this would be a neuron that responds strongly. This number here in dark blue responds strongly when there's just one item present. Okay, so this has a tuning for seeing just one item in effect. In light blue, this is a neuron that responds when there are 2 items, and it doesn't respond really at all to one item, and it responds moderately when there are 3 items. So they have a preferred number of items, but they do respond to adjacent numbers a little bit as well. And here, this is a neuron that responds to number 3, to 3 dots, and responds a little bit to 2 and to 4. This one responds to 4, 5. And then you can kind of go onwards and upwards, and you can show that basically that you will have numbers tuned to different quantities, but eventually they kind of become a little bit blurred together. So a neuron that is tuned to the number 12 will also respond strongly to 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, and less strongly to, say, the number 2. So it has these broader tuning curves. So basically what happens is that as you kind of go along the set size, you can see it here, for instance, in the orange one, that the orange one responds strongly to 4, but it also responds quite strongly to 5 and 3, whereas these neurons that respond to 1 and 2 have much sharper curves. And this basically is the origin in single neurons in a monkey as to why we struggle to discriminate exactly larger quantities when we see them like this, is that basically we have sets of neurons that are tuned to this, but the tuning curves just become broader as the numbers get bigger, that they might respond roughly to 12, but not exactly to 12. But you will have neurons that respond exactly to the numbers 1, 2, 3, and then they become gradually more blurred out. Okay. Does that make any sense? So these number neurons, that they respond not only, in this case, when you've got an array of dots presented, so you've got 4 or 5 dots presented at once, they also respond if you've got sequences, so you just see one after the other. So this is a little bit like a form of counting, really, but obviously these are monkeys. These don't have language. They cannot count in the way we can by assigning words to things as they see them. They are just somehow keeping track. They're not just visual as well, so you can show that they respond to the number of sounds. Obviously the sounds here wouldn't be presented simultaneously. You would present beep, 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 and that would be 3, for instance, and they would be able to separate 3 from 4, but and so on. Monkeys don't have number symbols like the digit for 8, but you can train them to have number symbols. You just give them a peanut when they kind of link together 8 dots with that or whatever, and then probably not 8, it would be smaller sets, so the numbers 1 to 5 probably. And what you find is that these number neurons become tuned then to the symbols that are associated with the dots, as well as the actual dots themselves. Interestingly, what was found here is that this was more kind of in the frontal lobes than in the core number meaning system. And that's also interesting because when you do fMRI scanning of children, you often get, when they're doing number tests, you often get more in the frontal lobes than the parietal lobes. And it suggests that what they're doing is that you're kind of born with your number kit in the parietal lobes, but as you learn your language thing, you're having to make that connection. And you're shifting from the kind of the symbols being in the frontal lobes to linking them in the parietal lobes. So developmentally, you see this kind of frontal to parietal shift as kids get older. And so your mature number system is more parietal, basically. Is there a difference between the left and the right hemisphere in terms of processing number? Basically, when you do fMRI studies, you typically find that both the left and the right intraparietal sulcus are active. But there are some differences that kind of emerge. And one suggestion is that the left hemisphere is particularly specialised for dealing with exact quantities, whereas the right hemisphere deals more with approximate quantities. And obviously the claim here is that to do process exact quantities, you are relying more on language to do that, and that's why your left number system has a bit more specificity than this. So for instance, this was a dyscalculic patient who had left hemisphere lesions. And if you asked the patient to add up 5 plus 7, they would say roughly 13. So they didn't know that the answer was 12, but nor did they say that the answer was 90 or 2 or something ridiculous. Okay? So it suggests that they have a rough idea of the answer, but they cannot give it exact. So it suggests that the right hemisphere knows roughly the answer. It's not that their number sense has been wiped from their brain. Otherwise, they would just say, I don't know, or they would give a ludicrous answer. And you can also look at this in split brain patients. So the classic split brain procedure basically separates the left and the right hemisphere of the brains. You cut what's called the corpus callosum, the white matter that separates the cortex. The two hemispheres are still connected subcortically, but the main roots are disconnected. And what you can do here is that you can present things either in the left side of space, so your right hemisphere sees them, or the right side of space, so your left hemisphere sees them. And you can ask, in this case, the patient to say what digit it sees, or whatever. So in this patient here, they presented the left and the right hemisphere patient with different numbers and asked them to say it. basically, when the left hemisphere is presented with a digit, it's very accurate. It doesn't make errors. So here you're presenting it with the number 5, and it will say the correct answer. When you present the right hemisphere with numbers, here it was symbolic numbers, so digits and so on, it made lots of errors. But again, as with the patient reported before, the errors were plausible errors. So if it sees the right hemisphere sees the number 5, it might say it's 6, but it's unlikely to say it's 29 or something outlandish like that. So it gets it right within a few digits, in effect. So it suggests that the right hemisphere and the left hemisphere both have number meaning, but the left can interface with the language system, enabling this more exact processing of number, and the right just gives you a rough approximation, even when you're dealing with symbols, which are supposedly in themselves an exact quantity. There's no vagary between 8 and 9 when you see it written down, as opposed to seeing dots, but in the brain there is. So how do we put this together? So the standard model of numerical cognition is de Haan's Triplecode model. And the idea here is that numbers are represented in multiple systems of the brain, and in effect skilled adult numeracy is the cooperation of these 3 systems. So in de Haan's model, basically what you have is that in your parietal lobes, your intraparietal sulcus, you have what he calls an analog magnitude representation. This does all the things that we just talked about, so comparing, approximate calculation, estimation, and maybe subitizing, giving small exact quantities but not large exact quantities. And that is what your number meaning system does. It does all these things. What you then have are these 2 more culturally acquired systems that sit on top of that. One is a verbal system that is more in your left hemisphere, that deals with things like your times table, the things that you learn at school, your counting, for instance, which are in and of themselves kind of language-based skills that you learn, and some cultures still don't learn. And then you've got your what he calls the visual number form. This is, for instance, your written set of digits when you're kind of processing them visually as opposed to verbally. So what he calls multi-digit operations, so adding together 53 and 92, for instance, where you would look at the place system and do things like that. So here, this is kind of a good example where you've got this mix of kind of culturally based systems and these kind of non-culturally based systems that come together enabling skilled maths. But even without culture, if you look at cultures without number words, young children, other species, you still have this going on. Okay. What this... I won't go into that level of detail. I'll talk about this one here. So this is basically how you kind of transfer between one system and another. And basically in this study, again also from de Haan's group, effectively what you're doing is that you're learning new number facts. So it's a bit like countdown, where you have to do, for instance, your 14 times table. So for most people, if I asked you to do 14 times 13, for you, that would be something that you have to calculate. Whereas if I asked you to do 12 times 12, you wouldn't have to calculate that, because that is part of your verbal knowledge of numbers. Okay? What you're doing here is that you're teaching people, for instance, their 13 and 14 times table, and you can look in the brain how it shifts from one system to another, in effect. So what you have here is that when you've got untrained items, so if I ask you to do your 13 or 14 times table, you use your core calculation system. So this is your intraparietal sulcus, that you are having to treat these as numbers, in effect, and you're having to work out what the exact answer is. Whereas if you already know that and you're simply just retrieving from memory, the idea is that you're using your verbal system here, and you're just pulling out multiplication tables as if you've learnt them. And in effect, that's what you find here is that when you've highly trained on this, you activate a different system. And in a way, knowing that 12 times 12 is 144, you don't actually need to know about numbers. It's almost like just a verbal thing there. And that's also what you will find in patients who become dyscalculic, is that often they can still recite their times table, but as soon as you give them something to calculate that they haven't done before, or if you give them something like 25 minus 12, which isn't part of your times table, they will go to pieces with that. So again, even patients with dyscalculia, they can learn by rote, but that is of very limited help in the real world, because your times table is just a small fraction of the space of number possibilities that you will encounter in real life.